Okay, maybe we shall get started. This is the second of the post-training lectures. We're going to talk about the exciting developments in RLVR, or reinforcement learning from verifiable rewards. And I think this is in some ways very timely. I didn't get to update the slide, but there was just a kind of announcement, by OpenAI folks that they had solved one of the kind of major ERDIsh problems. So that's a open math problem using one of their thinking models. How does that thing work? That's exactly this thinking model stuff, or RLVR stuff. And so thus far, where we're at is we are kind of at the left side here, right? After we finished last lecture, we've got kind of instruction tuning, we've got RLHF, we've got some good stuff. That's ChatGPT. And what remains is kind of the modern developments in thinking models. The model ability to do very long COT and solve these hard verifiable problems like mathematics and coding in some cases as well. And remember that I ended last lecture with kind of this little bit of a downer note. The RLHF wasn't really going to get us where we wanted to go because of this problem called over-optimization, right? So we're going to go and collect a bunch of preference data. Preference data is very useful. We will build some reward model, and then we will RL against that reward model. But this thing is fundamentally very annotation bottlenecked, right? Because we have a reward model, and you can't keep putting compute into the same reward model. Eventually, you're going to overfit your reward model, and no matter how good of a job you do at regularizing, eventually you're going to run into this problem with overfitting. And so really, this is very depressing, and it's not really the potential of reinforcement learning. If you're a big reinforcement learning believer, you're going to look at all sorts of things like AlphaGo and so on, where you say, well, in these domains, RL really did an amazing job. What is the difference between what we're doing in RLHF and what has been achieved in these more RL native or RL natural domains? And really, the difference, I would say, or one major difference between something like AlphaGo and something like RLHF is that in AlphaGo, we are optimizing exactly what we want, right? You get the win-loss conditions of the game of Go. You don't have any sort of sloppiness to that definition. And so you can just put in as much compute as you want, and as long as the objective improves, you're doing well, right? In some sense, these are search problems, whereas the top one is much more of a learning problem. Not quite a precise distinction, but that's one way of thinking about it. So now there might be other domains, like formal mathematics or even natural language mathematics, that have this flavor of being more verifiable and therefore much more amenable to reinforcement learning. So that's going to be kind of the motivation for why we're going to study some of these. And the algorithms aren't going to be that different, fundamentally. But where we will end up will actually be surprisingly different. And so the lecture is going to be in two parts today. This kind of mirrors a lot of how we've structured the course in other parts. So in the first part of the lecture, I'm going to talk about the core algorithms. This is basic knowledge for you all. You will use some of this for your assignments. And so I'm going to talk about things like what is GRPO, how does PPO work. And then after I've done that, I'm going to dig through a bunch of open source releases and show you how what I've taught you in the first part sort of reflects in the technical reports of many of these major open source model releases. Okay? So we're going to dive into the methods and sort of basics section. And the first thing that I'm going to start with is PPO, right? We can't really discuss RL for language models without discussing PPO. And even though we've done it once, PPO is confusing enough that I think you will benefit from doing it twice, right? The most important thing to identity, let's say, to remember in RL for language modeling is policy gradients. And in particular, kind of this reinforce gradient trick, right? What we are always going to be doing is gradient descent on our rewards. And we are going to do so by taking essentially weighted SFT updates, where the weights might be positive or negative. We will define what R is. But this equation is important because it will reappear throughout this lecture. This is, in some sense, the core from which everything else is derived. Now, building upon that, remember that the intuition from last lecture was we want to take more than one step at a time. A policy gradient requires us to sample from our policy every time we want to take a gradient step. Can we reuse our rollouts? Well, you can do TRPO, you can do PPO, and so on and so forth, right? I'll talk about PPO in a minute, and I've already talked about TRPO. I won't really get too much into this. If you've taken an RL course, PPO is of course well understood to you, like you understand this algorithm. But I don't assume that all of you have taken an RL class and or understand RL. And so PPO, in case you're not familiar, is a kind of real workhorse of RL. It's been used in a variety of very difficult RL settings. OpenAI has done quite a few of these in their early days of being very RL pilled. They had, this was the, I think, OpenAI Gym, where they were talking about the PPO algorithm, and they're like, hey, we can get these people to walk around using reinforcement learning. And a much more dramatic demonstration of this was their OpenAI bot, which they trained using PPO. And so this can excel with kind of deep RL and like high dimensional action and state spaces where it's much more complicated to do RL than it is usually. Oh. Yeah, and there's the OpenAI man running around. All right. So at a conceptual level, PPO is actually very simple, right? Remember that I told you, an important part of all of this is getting rid of PPO. That's been a motivating factor for a lot of people. But if you look at the pseudocode of PPO, this is from, the OpenAI's like spinning up on RL documentation. You look at this and you say, this is not that bad. This is actually like pretty easy. I could implement this in one go. You sample some trajectories. I compute something called an advantage using any method of advantage estimation. I clip the advantage in this like kind of slightly strange but okay way. And then I update the policy under this clipped advantage. And that's fine, right? And then I can fit something called a value function as well. Okay, fine. This is all relatively easy looking in practice. And so I think because of this, people are like, oh, it's okay, PPO is totally fine. But then you see blog posts that look like this, and this should strike fear into your heart, right? Because if you see a blog post that says the 37 implementation details of PPO, you know that this is an algorithm that is very sensitive to your implementation decisions, right? And there's all sorts of things that you can do, and all sorts of different libraries and implementations, and they give totally different numbers based on which ones you use. And it turns out that many people have implemented this wrong, and so there's papers saying like actually the baselines that some people use in PPOs aren't even baselines at all. They fundamentally change the optimization problem. And so basically because of this, I think I would not be able to get through the rest of the lecture without telling you, well, we actually maybe need to start looking at some implementations of PPO. And the implementations of PPO, let me tell you, for language models are not particularly pleasant. This is a very good representative slide. If anything, this is a very good description of what PPO looks like. You've got advantage estimation, this big block in the middle, that's this advantage thing. You've got an experience buffer because you're going to keep some of the old stuff. It's going to be training this value model, and the value model is being used in the advantage estimation calculation. Notice how the green box appears twice. And importantly, some parts of my objective, the KL term, actually operates token by token. So it's not actually just a bandit problem. It's like a whole multi-step RL problem. And this is all very difficult and complicated. And so this has led to a variety of really tricky implementation things that you have to do. And if you look at a variety of implementations, you find often that there are things that people do for PPO that are a little bit strange and tricky at times. Let me see if I can find one of my students implemented PPO for a project a while back doing RLHF, right? So PPO, if you remember, was used in RLHF. And so, we had this nice, robust reference implementation of PPO. And it took a long time to get working. So I looked into the details. What did we actually do to get this thing to work? The outer loop is fine. The outer loop is something like you go through your rollouts and you're going to take some PPO steps. You're going to compute some loss and clip some gradients and take some steps, right? Totally reasonable outer loop. But then you start kind of looking into it. For now, the actual inner compute loss part follows almost exactly the PPO update. So this also looks mostly good. We're computing things like the advantages, and we're computing the clipping ratios, and then we're updating the model based on that. So this is all kind of good. But then you kind of get to some of the messier parts. Actually, I'll skip the rollouts, where you have things like, well, maybe we need KL penalties to sort of keep the original model close to the reference. But actually, this only works if you clip the KL off at 0, which of course, if you know anything about KL divergences, that totally ruins the point of a KL divergence, right? You have both positive and negative values being summed. If you remove this, it blows up immediately, right? All sorts of things like this can happen. This is not to say that this is the way you should implement PPO if you were doing it. I think the reason why I'm bringing this up is to say implementations for RL algorithms can be somewhat tricky and somewhat sensitive because of all the moving pieces in PPO and because of the high variance in the gradient estimates. Like these are all very, very tricky things that are happening. And another thing that you often see, this one is not just our implementation, it's very common. In the original PPO paper, you have this thing called a generalized advantage estimator that's basically looking at this like gamma discounted reward where you have this value function that's estimating the reward at every token generation step. But it turns out that people often just use gamma equals lambda equals 1, which is just a degenerate setting that turns this back into a bandit problem. So you've kind of thrown away a lot of the structure that you get from PPO. And so like if you run this algorithm after a bunch of engineering, you will get what you expect. And when you run your RL algorithms for the assignment, you should expect to see similar things like the rewards go up, the reward model rewards go up if you're doing RLHF, and then the negative KL regularizers kind of go down. This is a reasonable thing to expect to see. But anyway, the point of all of this is to say implementation of PPO can be quite painful. Depending on the environment, it can require hacks to stabilize. All of this is kind of painful. Not to say that it's not possible. Lots of people have trained very good models on PPO. Many of the labs have sort of very turnkey solutions for getting PPOs to work at scale. So this is not impossible. But for people like researchers who are implementing this from scratch, PPO can just be really finicky and complicated. Another reason why PPO is disfavored in many cases is that it requires a value model to estimate kind of the value at each token as you go. And how big is the value model? Well, it's as big as the original model. So this consumes some memory that you would rather be using for other stuff like models or inference servers. So now you might say, well, in last lecture, you told us about this DPO thing, and DPO seems pretty good. Why don't we just use DPO for everything? Well, the problem is DPO is a very specific solution to a very specific problem. DPO is good for pairwise feedback in the form of Bradley-Terry comparisons. That is very specific, right? And if I want to solve math problems, my math problems don't come in the form of inherently pairwise comparisons. There are other DPO variants that are designed to sort of break that pairwise structure, but really, you're just kind of using the wrong hammer for the job, right? You do not want to use DPO necessarily for what you would normally use PPO for. PPO is the more general hammer that you can hit kind of everything with. DPO is generally offline, although I think this distinction is very overstated because it can be made online by just iterating DPO repeatedly. So I don't think this is necessarily a big difference. Okay, so that's the context for all of this. And then that similarly to DPO, there's just an enormous desire by the research community to not have to use PPO, right? Hopefully the fact that DPO and GRPO have gotten adoption tells you how painful it was to get this to work in many cases. And so GRPO, much like DPO, is the alternative. It is the simpler way to do RL for verifiable tasks. It has taken over, for the most part, RLVR in the open source, open knowledge, let's call it, community. And it is very, very similar to PPO in spirit. It just strips out a couple of the most complicated parts, and by doing so, allows us to have a much simpler algorithm. So GRPO is by a DeepSeek paper. I think it was their DeepSeek math paper, where you start with PPO, right? Conceptually, it says PPO is a good idea, but we want to change just a few things. And what does it change? It changes arguably the most complicated and annoying part of PPO, which is the value function, right? So the value function is the thing that you subtract as a baseline to reduce variance of your gradient updates. The value function is a whole neural network. It destabilizes training. We don't want the value network. So what do? Well, we get rid of the value network, but we still need an advantage. I don't want to do vanilla reinforce, because the variance of that is going to be really, really high. So instead, what we're going to do is I'm going to compute advantage as a z-score within a group. And I'll explain what that means in a moment. But basically, the idea is kind of the following. normally you kind of look at a reward that you get, and if you had a value function, you would compare it to your predicted value. You would say, my neural network says I should have gotten a score of 5, I got a score of 6, so this is a good rollout, right? That's usually what you do. Instead, what you would do is you would get, let's say your rollout with a score of 5, you would now sample 10 other rollouts, and you would say, how good was I compared to my 10 other rollouts, right? If I'm doing better than my mean, then I have a high advantage, right? In some ways, a very natural way of computing advantage in contexts where you can multiple sample from the same prompt or something like that. So GRPO is exactly this idea. If you look at the initial definition of GRPO that appeared in the DeepSeek paper, you see this is the objective that's being optimized. They're going to do exactly the PPO update where they have this like min clipped advantage plus a KL term to keep yourself close to the reference. And then KL is computed in a particular way. That detail is not particularly important. And importantly, this advantage is computed as a z-score over samples of a group of outputs, O of 1 through O of G, right? So that's or within each group, you have, this advantage of I, this is the place where you compute the advantage. What you do is you take the reward over your rollouts within each group, you subtract the mean, and you divide by the standard deviation, right? So you get a z-score for each group. So in the online case, and this is an important distinction because in many cases you may actually end up running this online rather than offline. In the online case, the clipping, right, just kind of disappears because the ratio between pi theta old and pi theta is 1, this clipping operator never does anything. And you just get min A of I. So this is just advantage minus a KL penalty, right? So I'm going to do RL on my advantage, which is defined by this. So in the online rollout case, it is a very, very simple object that kind of makes sense as a RL target. So I can pause here for a moment in case any of the conceptual bits of GRPO are not clear. I mean, in some sense, this is the foundation of all of the exciting math stuff, or you can replicate all of the exciting math stuff using GRPO, so it's worth understanding in a little bit of detail before we sort of move on to some of the nitty-gritty details. Okay, good. Simple enough that everyone understands in one go. I will take it. And GRPO is very, very simple. Because of the lack of value function, you can basically write down kind of all of GRPO in a very simple block of code where you just say, I'm going to roll out, k times. I'm going to compare my, observed rollout to those k sort of references, z-score it, and then just take a reinforced gradient against those weights, right? So you will write this in your assignment, and it's going to involve a very simple set of steps. Compute a reward for each of your k rollouts. Normalize your rollouts, compute the KL term, and then just take gradient updates on the combination of your KL term and these rollouts. You'll have to do a little bit of thinking because in order to do this using autodiff, you will have to do a stop grad somewhere, but it's actually not that complicated. And you can sort of see that you can do a one-page implementation of this basic idea, right? And this is a reference implementation of GRPO that I took from some folks at McGill, which has a really nice little toy version of this whole thing. And the computation of the group indices and like the standard deviation calculation and all of this just kind of fits in one half of a slide. The only thing that they do differently than like the literal paper write-up of GRPO here is they add a little tiny 1e-4 to the standard deviation calculation to prevent it from blowing up when you only have a single sample or if your samples happen to have the exact same rewards, right? Which does happen if you're in a domain where you can get exactly numerically 0 rewards, like you failed to solve a math problem. But hopefully this emphasizes to you kind of how straightforward GRPO is and why almost all open source work has been built on this algorithm. It's easy to implement, easy to understand, and if you, as we'll see in the results, it provides fairly compelling results in terms of emulating a lot of what the closed source labs have done using potentially PPO. Okay, so how well does it work? In the original DeepSeek math paper, which if you're into sort of math AI stuff, I would encourage you to read. It's a nice and really interesting set of results. They show that GRPO, the yellow and the blue lines, does much better than RFT, like rejection fine-tuning. You'll implement this as a baseline as well. That's just taking the correct answers that your model generates and training on them and throwing away everything else, right? And they seem to show process supervision, which is grading not just the final answer, but grading the intermediates, give you some gains. I'll talk more about that later. That is an important thing to discuss and cover, because that's one of the big sort of design decisions for these kinds of RL problems. But for now, you can just internalize the fact that GRPO works. The blue and yellow lines are above the others. Okay, so now let's think a little bit more about the GRPO objective. Like, what is happening in this objective? Are we actually taking policy gradients? There are important conceptual questions that we should really think through. And so if we think about the difference between GRPO and PPO, right? Remember that PPO had this value function thing, which feeds into the advantage. And in GRPO, we strip that out and we replace that with the z-score guy, right? This A of I ratio of R minus mean divided by standard deviation. So is this a good advantage, right? I think for those of you that have been in an RL class, you kind of already know the answer to this question. Like, is this a good advantage function? What makes a good advantage, or what makes a valid advantage function? Well, if you look at Sutton and Bardo, the big kind of classic book for reinforcement learning, they will say, well, there's this algorithm called reinforce with baseline. And the things you're allowed to do is that, if you're doing policy gradients, right, which is this line over here, this very first equation, right, I want to take my gradient step on the direction of my rewards. And the thing you can do is you can take your rewards and I can subtract any what they call state-dependent baseline. In this case, our state, if we're in the bandit world, is just the prompt, right? So you can have a prompt-dependent baseline that you can subtract. And anything that does just this is a valid form of a policy gradient. So you're still going to descend in the same direction as long as you do this. And depending on your choice of B, you will either have lower or higher variance in doing this gradient descent process. Now, you should probably notice that what we're doing is not this, right? We are not just subtracting a constant value, we are also dividing by the standard deviation. And so that is kind of a problem. It turns out, well, it's in some ways a problem, in other ways it's not, right? If you really want a conceptually clear algorithm that really does what's like written on the tin, like it actually descends the reward. GRPO does not do that, right? Because as I've highlighted in red here, right, GRPO divides by the standard deviation, which breaks sort of this kind of baseline contract. We're not just subtracting a baseline, we're also normalizing by the standard deviation of my rewards. You could, of course, there's another thing that GRPO does, which I didn't mention earlier, as an implementation detail that is kind of tricky, which is GRPO does this kind of almost per token, right? So they'll divide by the total length of the sequence as a normalization factor. But if you sort of try to derive GRPO from first principles following the policy gradient and baseline theorems, you'll end up with something different. You won't have a length normalizer, and you won't have the standard deviation normalization, right? And some folks, soon after GRPO came out, noticed this, and they wrote a paper basically saying, well, if you don't, do these like two things that are different, then you get very different, potentially very positive behavior. I will talk about that, also when we get to the, not OpenAI, sorry, DeepSeek R1 paper. Okay, but the main thing here is to say, GRPO is not the first principles derivation of this idea. It is actually doing something slightly different with both pros and cons. So what are these two terms doing? We now know that GRPO is not actually directly descending on the reward objective. We know that it has these two correction factors. What do they do? Well, the length normalization is easier to see, right? So what are we doing? We are dividing, longer sequences with a bigger number. And so what this will do is that it's going to encourage the model to generate long outputs, right? When you're wrong, it will encourage you to generate wrong outputs. Because let's say I know that I'm going to get a math proof wrong. I'm going to incur my negative reward of, let's say, -1. I'm just going to generate an infinitely long string. If I do that, I'll get to divide by infinity, and I'll get to totally get rid of my negative penalty, right? That's an extreme case, but you kind of understand that if you divide by the output, you encourage the model to blab on once it realizes that it cannot actually solve the problem, right? So this is a length problem that you'll end up getting. If you fix that, you'll find that often, what people have observed in GRPO of like, COT, like chain of thought thinking length, growing and growing and growing, that actually turns out to just cap off at a constant rather than just continually and forever grow. So this seems like a potentially good thing, and especially on the incorrect cases, you really don't want to be generating longer and longer and longer outputs. So the standard deviation normalization, this one's a little bit more complicated, but if you think about it, what I'm doing is I'm dividing by the standard deviation. And so this can be thought of as emphasizing problems where the standard deviation is small, right? And when is my standard deviation small for a binary reward problem? Well, that's when the problems are too easy or too hard, right? If my problem is really easy and I get 100% all the time, I'm going to divide by 1 over, or the number. I'm going to divide by basically 0, right? Because there's 0 variation if I always get a question correct. Similarly, if I always get a question wrong, I have 0 variation in my rewards. I'm going to upweight that significantly, right? So the standard deviation term is upweighting sort of the two sides, both easy and hard questions. That seems like clearly a thing that maybe we don't want, because we want our models to potentially learn on kind of things that are within its solvability range. Okay, so that's kind of the algorithmic components of RLVR. And I'm going to go through several of the different recent model releases and kind of talk through all of the algorithmic components that I think are quite important, including some of the stuff that I added this year that's new, which is really the agentic stuff that I think has been catching on and is increasingly important for using and deploying these models. But before I do that, I can pause here, and if anyone has algorithmic questions, I'll take them before I move on. Okay, good. All right. So we're going to start with DeepSeek R1, because I think this is, a bit of a social phenomenon. I think everyone should know, a bunch about DeepSeek R1. I think it's a lovely paper, kicked off the wave of open source RLVR models. And what's remarkable about it, I think it was really the first thing to have matched OpenAI 01's sort of behavior, right? So the key things about OpenAI 01 was you have very long chains of thought. It's clearly RL'd, and you have really good performance on hard math problems, right? And they also provided a RL recipe that anyone could do. And I think from the perspective of R&D, this is very important, right? If your solution was like you have this horrible PPO thing that no one but DeepSeek can run, then that is much less of an impact, at least for us researchers, than this like kind of GRPO thing, which anyone can really play with, even you in sort of your assignments. And finally, they have some really interesting sort of distillation insights that I think have held up, even now. Okay, so the starting point of DeepSeek R1, and I think you can kind of see how a lot of DeepSeek's like expertise build on each other. So that, they had this DeepSeek math paper where they were doing GRPO. They had already understood a lot of the nuances of RLing on math problems. And so because of this, they started off with a lot of the components of DeepSeek math. But one of the really important differences, and I'll sort of highlight an expert just because I think it's particularly important, is they abandoned process supervision, which was the thing that worked really well in DeepSeek math. And they go only with outcome supervision. And just to be clear, outcome supervision is when you have reward only for whether the final answer is correct or incorrect. And process supervision is when you have a grading rubric, let's say, to check the validity of intermediate steps in a proof. A lot of people thought process supervision was important. Turned out it wasn't critical for a lot of things. So R1 was interesting in that it has a lot of different components. But one of the very interesting components is R1.0, where they don't really do that much post-training. So they have a base model. Of course, the base model, as we all know now, is also mid-trained. And so this guy can do some amount of instruction following. And then on top of this base model, they do, basically RLVR, where the rewards for their GRPO algorithm is accuracy rewards for whether they correctly solve a collection of math problems, and format rewards. And this one's important because the format rewards basically allow them to strip out the chain of thought later. They want the model to properly use thinking tags to enclose their COT. But this is a very simple recipe. GRPO is very simple. Accuracy rewards are very simple. In fact, you will implement and replicate essentially this set of results in some ways. And you do just this very simple recipe, and where do you end up? Well, you end up something that is only a little bit worse than OpenAI 01, right? So this is really, really, really clean. And I like this result because it has none of the messes of like a real production post-training pipeline thrown in. You don't really question whether like, oh, was it because of the RLHF helping or this or that? It's a very simple base model plus GRPO. Your math abilities are quite good. And I think R1 also kind of took off partially because of the interesting phenomena they claim to have observed in the paper. So one of the things they claim to have observed is, as we go longer and longer and longer during training, the model is able to think for longer and longer and longer. Their COTs get longer and longer and longer. And they also highlighted this thing that I believe went viral on social media, which is like, the aha moment, where the model is like, if you train it for enough, its COT is able to do things like, there's an aha moment that I can flag here, and they thought this was really interesting. It is unclear to me whether either of these phenomena are really particularly impressive in many ways. Like, we now know that longer COTs is arguably a natural side effect of the length normalization of the GRPO algorithm. And the aha moment, others have showed is actually appears in even the base model. And so clearly it can't just be a result of the RL algorithm, right? Like, lots of people say, aha, I can use this as part of solving the math problem. The model has learned it during pre-training. It's not surprising at all that somehow during RL it just happens to get extracted because it's, emitting a lot of math tokens, right? So I think the phenomena that was highlighted is not particularly salient or exciting, but I do think R1 was a really important milestone in that it highlighted just how simple RLVR could be, right? This is very, in some sense, clean as an algorithm and as a way of solving these really difficult problems. And so R10 was this very nice, clean, controlled setting, and then R1 was their attempt to kind of productionize this system. And I think one thing that's nice about R1, and I'll show you the Quen equivalent later, is you can kind of see how you kind of stack all the pieces together, right? I think we've studied all the pieces in isolation. Like, we know where pre-training is, we know that there's RLHF, we know SFT, but how do we compose all of the pieces to actually get a system at the end? Well, usually the thing that you do is something like, well, we have our mid-trained model, we're going to do a bunch of reasoning training, maybe some long context extension somewhere too, and then we're going to do RLHF at the end because that's in some sense the most user-facing object, right? Like, we want to make sure that the formatting and all of this is nice. RLHF can very much help with that process. One of the other things that they did was they added a language consistency reward for the chain of thought for their production model. I think if I remember the report right, this was because the R10 style training without a consistency reward would like kind of language switch in COT. And they thought this was like very uninterpretable and slightly disturbing. And so they wanted to just have it output a single consistent language. And so they do this just for sort of interpretability reasons. And then they have some of the non-verifiable rewards as well thrown in to GRPO, almost as kind of blending into the RLHF process. But otherwise, it's a very, very similar thing, and the whole pipeline, I think, is very straightforward. So for SFT, what they kind of do is pretty simple. So in R10, they don't want to do any SFT at all, but in R1, they're willing to do long COT data. And when you're reading these open source tech reports, it's kind of fun to try to read between the lines. When they say something like, we construct and collect a small amount of long COT data, you might wonder, I wonder if that was distilled from some other models. Not that that is a particularly like negative thing for open source models. Everyone is nowadays doing this, but I just kind of find it funny that it's like very carefully written. Collect a small amount of long COT data. And so this is used to fine-tune the model. We know that for a very good base model, just SFT on long COT can unlock a lot of O1 style capabilities. And that's a great starting point for RL. So they start there, and then they add some verification to filter out these COTs. And then they continue on with processing. And I think many papers since then Some, including some from my students, have shown things that, if you have the right kind of distillation procedure and you have the right kinds of base model, you can basically get a lot of the long COT sort of reasoning juice just from SFT, right? And I think this is maybe interesting because one of the things that I think is still an open question is like, do you really need RL for some of this? And I think maybe one way of thinking about the role of RL in language modeling is that RL is a great source of supervision, right? Like if you're solving frontier math problems, you just don't have the supervision to get detailed long COTs. And RL allows you to self-generate that. But once someone has generated these long COTs, you could potentially also learn from imitation. And that seems to be kind of what a lot of these like distillation results partially show. Okay. So the RL part for R1 is basically the same as R10, minus the language consistency loss that I mentioned. It's basically just we run the RL training using GRPO. And that leads to essentially the final phase, which is what we learned about last lecture. So we do some basic instruction tuning style SFT, and then RLHF. For non-verifiable tasks, they basically use the same thing as DeepSeek v3. So there's really no surprises at all here. How well does it work? It's kind of really, really good, right? And I think this is the reason why there was all that kind of panic or like big sort of noticing of DeepSeek, because R1 was genuinely a very good model. Like it beat O1 on many of the categories. Like it matched a lot of the test time scaling behavior that people expected, and it came from a very simple recipe. So it was very easy to understand where the gains were coming from. And the last thing related to some of the distillation discussions that I was saying is you can then take R1's COTs and you could put it into Qwen 2.5, and if you did so, you could really significantly boost the performance of these models. Like in some cases, sort of matching a lot of these specialized thinking models. And so in other words, really if you can get the right kinds of long COTs that are legible to these models, often it is possible to get them to reason for long periods of time. Like the base models are already surprisingly good, and this works even for llama models as well, which I think is quite fascinating. Okay, so to close out kind of the sort of DeepSeek saga, I quite like a lot of the DeepSeek tech reports because they often do both ablations and they also tell you failed things that didn't work. And if you've been following, what they've been doing, DeepSeek Math has all of this like process reward model stuff. It's like we got to verify all the steps. And then you read R1 and you say like, where did the process reward models go? Well, they tell you where the process reward models go, which is we tried to get process reward models to work. They just didn't do very much for us. It turns out that outcome reward models are great and they're good enough, and you can scale the data for those a lot better. I think a big debate for PRMs was where are you going to get these like step-by-step rubrics, right? And it's very hard to scale that up. I think at this point it's quite clear now that outcome reward models are very, very good, and that's kind of the bulk of where the action is happening. Similarly, if you were kind of around for the initial O1 release, a lot of people speculated about what was going on inside OpenAI's O1. They were like, oh, are they doing PRMs? Are they doing tree search like AlphaGo, right? They too tried a lot of MCTS and they sort of describe we couldn't get it to work very well. I just very much want to highlight and sort of like the fact that they're very open about all these explorations and the things that they tried and didn't work, rather than to say like, they didn't try it at all. Cool. All right. And if I talk about, actually I'll pause here in case anyone has questions, although I don't know if, yeah.
You should explain the positive reward cases when you say treating more staff days to like longer series. Because I guess that you said for negative, like we encourage to divide by infinity and get it 0, and for positive, like.
Yeah, so the question was like for positive cases, what does the length normalizer do? And of course in those cases, the length normalizer encourages you to shorten the COT, which is good if you want to save on inference costs, bad if that degrades your accuracy. But I think the main issue is that for the negative ones, like you get like some really long responses. In the positive cases, it can't shrink it that much because there's a lower bound to how small your COT can go, to solve a particular problem.
Right, I guess I'm trying to understand that explanation for the for the diagram. You said, like,
Yeah, I think Dr. GRPO has a cleaner diagram of this. So like, in the R1 diagram, this is all aggregated. This is like all of the responses across their evals. It's not just the positive ones. But if we look at the Dr. GRPO plot over here, so this is like the average output length, and this is the incorrect output length, right? And so you kind of see that, and the correct output length is here, right? So you kind of see somewhat that like this is really being driven by the incorrect ones, as we kind of would expect from the explanation. So the story, at least in these sets of controlled comparisons, is quite clean and clear. Yeah. Cool. So now I'm also going to talk about an alternative method, Kimi K1.5, or alternative paper and approach. And I always feel like when I talk about R1, I'm obligated to talk about Kimi K1.5 because they kind of came out the same time as R1. They also beat O1, and yet everyone is all about DeepSeek, and Kimi is not quite as often brought up in the conversation, even though their models are extremely good. And I'm not just sort of talking about them out of pity per se. I think Kimi has this nice thing that they do some sets of things quite differently than DeepSeek. And we can learn quite a bit from like the fact that both of these work, right? I think this is kind of part of the theme of this class, which is by reading all of these tech reports and by looking at broader patterns, we can roughly start to understand what are kind of the valid or easy spaces to get these algorithms to work. So they do actually quite a bit more detail in talking about the data set construction and like curriculum generation for the RL process, which many have said is quite important. And they also have a different RL algorithm, which in some ways like has similar intuitions, but is not exactly GRPO. And so this is another nice validation that, technically speaking, I don't think you necessarily need something like GRPO to get these guys to work. Okay, so the first part I want to talk about is the data. The data remains very important for all of these processes. And for RL, there's an additional wrinkle of kind of curriculum, like what kinds of difficulties of problems do you want to throw in, right? In SFT, you don't really think about difficulty very much because you just sort of jam the data in there, right? Like for whatever data that you want, you just do pre-training losses and the model is forced to learn from these. In SFT, there's a little bit more of a subtlety. We talked quite a bit about sort of the hallucination issues, and maybe sometimes you don't want to train on some of this data. But for RL, there's this additional wrinkle that if your problems are too hard, you get no rewards, right? And if you get no rewards, you have no signal. And if you have no signal, you can't learn. So it's very important to kind of have broad coverage of the right kinds of examples. And so what the Kimi folks do is, first of all, they like try to get a whole big, broad range of coverage of data, unsurprising. They exclude multiple choice because that's kind of covered in lots of different domains. They want things that require long, deep thought, and their argument is maybe multiple choice doesn't have that. But maybe this last one, I think, is maybe the most important idea. This appears in a lot of different RL papers, right? You basically filter all the examples for things that sort of either pass, you filter them based on a best of K filter. So here, you take examples, and if they succeed on best of 8, like if you sample 8 times and the model can do it at least once, then that's not a great RL example because it's kind of already at the edge of the model's capabilities, right? You're not going to teach it anything particularly new. And so you only look at examples that basically fail this test because that allows us to essentially pick the right kinds of problems. And so this saves compute. It allows you to sort of skip problems entirely. You can also sort of filter on both sides to get problems that are neither too hard nor too easy. I think the general consensus in the research community is that doing this kind of like medium range difficulty filtering is very good if really what you want is for RL to like progress at a steady pace. As with DeepSeek, no description about SFT. We can speculate about what that is, but we have no concrete information. So I think the interesting thing about Kimi is that they have a DPO-inspired argument, but they end up actually in a place that's very similar as GRPO. And I think the fact that they end up in similar places is suggestive of which of these components are potentially useful if you're designing a new RL algorithm, for example. So they start at the exact same place as everyone else, right? So this should now look like very familiar to all of you. It's just, maximize the expected reward under my policy, and I've got this KL regularizer on the right that sort of keeps me close to my base policy, or maybe even the previous iterations policy, depending on how you're going to do this RL. So they're going to follow the same DPO-style derivation where they say, assume that I can maximize analytically, and I solve for the reward model that does that maximization, or corresponding to that maximization. And that's going to give me this ratio of policies. And I'm going to plug that back in to my objective up there and try to solve for what is happening. Well, what they're kind of now saying is they want to try to match the reward model. And for this equality to be, they want this equality to be true, which is true at the minimizer. And therefore, this is a big heuristic, if something's equal at the minimizer, why don't we just put a squared loss on that thing and minimize the squared loss? I think optimization people looking at this would be horrified at this, but I think this is a totally reasonable intuition in some ways, right? We know that these two things should be close when the model is good, so it is also maybe okay to treat making those two things explicitly close as a surrogate. This derivation, as you can see, is very, very different from GRPO, right? We're not going through the PPO path to derive this update. But now, actually, lo and behold, you take a gradient of this L, you end up with something that looks surprisingly like GRPO with an added regularizer term, right? What you end up with is this thing that is a policy gradient with a baseline R bar, and that R bar is actually the mean of each sort of condition, these X's. And you have this additional regularizer term, which is essentially the KL term that would appear in GRPO. So in some sense, we've reinvented the group mean normalized baseline through quite different means. And so, the Kimi folks, I think, in some ways, had a nicer or better view of the length problem. I think the GRPO folks were like, isn't it great that the length is growing uncontrollably? I'm sure our model is being smarter. That's a little bit of an uncharitable take, but when you present this as a positive thing, the implied statement is it's great that our model is thinking for longer. But the Kimi folks kind of look at this long COT problem and they say, well, if we're making long COTs, potentially that's very wasteful, right? We don't really want long COTs because COTs cost inference, right? So they not only do they not have a length problem, because if you look at this objective, they don't normalize by sequence length, but they actually want to go even further, and they want to compress the length of the response. And this is another sort of important sort of feature that we kind of see generally occurring in language model development. We want the COTs to be as short as possible. We want to solve hard problems. We don't want to think for very long, because when we think for very long, we have to kind of, essentially subsidize the user. If you're OpenAI and your users have the $200 Pro plan and your models are thinking for an hour at a time, that's not a very good place to be in, right? Whereas if your models are thinking for 5 minutes at a time, that is a great place to be in. And so for all of these reasons, Kimi wants to go and compress the COTs. How do you do that? Well, the simplest RL thing to do is you come up with a sort of heuristic length reward, and you just tack it on to the RL process. This reward is surprisingly complicated, and the thing that they're doing is you're trying to make longer sequences shorter and shorter. Correct answers also should be short. The interesting sort of balance here is if you make the incorrect answers too short, they no longer have a way to recover, right? It's so let me give you an example. Imagine I'm bad at geometry, right? I'm an AI, I'm bad at geometry, I get lots of incorrect answers. And the penalty makes my geometry COTs really short, right? Now my geometry COTs are 0, I'm really bad at geometry, I will never recover from this, right? I will never get a positive geometry reward ever again, and I'm stuck. And so what you do is you don't sort of force the incorrect answers to be super short, you incentivize them to be just a little bit shorter than sort of the average, right? So that the incorrect stuff doesn't grow unboundedly. And so this has in the end, a surprisingly reasonable set of outcomes. And so, as I said before, they have a really nice sort of RL set of views on how they do their data set curation. So not only do they have this data set that they filtered, they also look at the success rates of how often they're able to solve particular problems. And once a model masters a particular problem, it gets taken out of the problem set. So you save some compute doing that. I think basically everyone doing RL does these kinds of success rate filtering to avoid both wasting compute or working on problems that are way too hard for the model. And they basically have rewards that for code they take ground truth solutions and they generate some new test cases. And for math, they actually have a reward model to check for answer equivalence checks. And this is a really funny thing in some ways because we started out this lecture by saying we want to work on formal math or something truly verifiable, right? Where you can a compiler can check the correctness of your math. And then we've gone through most of the lecture, and then in the end, where have we ended up? Well, we ended up with a reward model, a reward model that checks the correctness of math answers. Once again, you'll kind of see why in the assignment, or maybe if you play with the assignment, you'll see why. You'll quickly find out that answer equivalence checking is a very difficult problem. Because in math, you can write equivalent things in many ways. And not only that, a language model can give the answer back in many ways. Even if you prompt it to say, give the answer back in LaTeX boxed, maybe sometimes it skips the boxed. Maybe add some extra stuff to the box, right? There are lots of ways that the model can just fail to get the right answer by a strict correctness checker, even though it has the right idea. And so for these reasons, basically, most RL sort of projects have a very complicated answer checker, either a regex or a model or who knows what, in order to avoid these kinds of problems. And it's a real rabbit hole getting the verified part of RLVR right. Cool. The last thing, which connects to some of the systems bits that we had talked about earlier and the inference bits, is RL optimization and RL infra is really quite hard. Training is hard and inference is hard, and RL puts the two together. So in some ways, no wonder is it really horrible and difficult. Even worse, I think one of the things that you don't initially appreciate about how hard it is to make RL efficient is kind of think of the following scenario. Now imagine you've got your rollouts, but you've got one really hard math problem. Let's say one of them is the Riemann hypothesis, and your model's really chugging along on the Riemann hypothesis. It's got this gigantic COT, right? Now what's happening? In the meantime, if you're doing naive inference, everyone else is waiting on this one rollout to complete in order to sort of move on to the next phase, right? So if you're doing these batch things, long rollouts can really hurt you. And so, RL really needs to deal with all of these sort of really tricky low-level details. So you need to deal with the fact that some COTs can get really long. Do you need to truncate them? Do you somehow set them into a different machine? Who knows, right? These are all decisions that you can make. If you switch from training to rollouts, you roll out once and then you train and you roll out and you train, you have to somehow deal with this. Either some of your machines are pure rollout machines and some of them are training machines, or you're switching out frameworks all the time. Both of them are very costly. And then finally, you have this really difficult and horrible trade-off, which is on-policy stuff is mathematically and training dynamics-wise very nice. Right? So GRPO in its simple on-policy form behaves very nicely. You will experience this in your assignments. And then you will get kind of greedy. You will say, but my systems utilization is so low, right? I could do so much better if only I could reuse my rollouts. Then I can overlap my inference and computation and do all sorts of clever things. And so you will attempt to reuse these rollouts, and that will lead to off-policy problems, which then lead to destabilizing your training and all sorts of things that are very difficult. So these are all sorts of things that end up getting very, very tricky. And so I think most open source technical reports will have, these days, a section talking about their RL infra. And their RL infra is going to have both a training part, that's the blue boxes over here, and an inference part, which is the green part on the right. And you're going to have to move weights from the training part to the inference part, so you need some sort of story for how to move those around. And you need to coordinate them closely. And in some cases, maybe they even share the same machines because as inference is running, the training one might be idle, right? So all of these are kind of complexities, and you have lots of very complicated systems, things to do. So we already know that Kimi beats OpenAI 01, but we also see some really nice things showing that like as RL proceeds, you're able to think longer and performance goes up. But in some cases, it's not that we're just unboundedly increasing tokens. We end up getting cases where I think OmniMath is a good example. You're not thinking for that much longer, but your performance continues to go up. So maybe this is a good example of sort of this length control kicking in and doing good things. The final thing I want to talk about is, you might wonder, is this actual RL stuff much better than just training on correct answers? This is called expert iteration. It worked very well in a number of past papers. In cases where you're dealing with very unstable stuff, you may actually want to do expert iteration instead. Kimi K1 has very large scale ablations showing that these kinds of RL methods work consistently better than expert iteration. So that's the orange beating the blue over here. So you can't really avoid RL if you want to squeeze out all of your performance. Okay, I can pause here in case anyone has questions about the Kimi stuff, and then I'll move on to the last of the three, which is Qwen 3. Great, okay. So the last one that I want to talk about is Qwen 3, and also Qwen 3.5 Next Coder. The names are getting complicated. And Qwen 3 is later, but they have actually really interesting scaling and data results, so I want to talk about those. And the successor to this, which is Qwen 3.5 Next Coder, is interesting because it, I think, has the most details of, I would say, like agentic RLVR training out of the major tech reports. And they do lots of cool things. Okay. So once again, as with DeepSeek, one of the nice things that we see with kind of the Qwen report is the full way that all of these are organized. And this is very similar to the DeepSeek structure, right? We do base model to basically SFT, then reasoning RL, and then they have this like thinking mode fusion. I'll talk about that later. And then they do RLHF, and then they have a model that gets shipped. But of course, they don't want to serve that directly, so they do distillation to get their smaller models, right? I mean, Qwen 3 is quite a respectable open source model. You can basically have this be your mental picture of how frontier-ish language models are built, putting all the components together, and I think you would have a pretty reasonable picture of what is happening, right? And Qwen uses basically at this point, tried and tested playbook for RLVR. I think they take lots of the best parts of Kimi and DeepSeek, and they sort of get it right. They do a lot of filtering for difficulty because we know that saves compute. That's a good way to get good data. They also do other things like they remove things that the model can get right without COT because we know that's not a thinking problem. They remove things that are too similar to validation data to try to decontaminate things. And then they sort of do a little bit of manual filtering on sort of reference COTs. Maybe most remarkably about Qwen 3 is they actually do their RL on very few examples, just 4,000 examples. But once again, if you kind of have the rest of the pipeline right, you can actually get surprisingly far. So the core of the RLVR components are maybe not super surprising because they are really building off of DeepSeek R1 and also Kimi. There are some interesting Qwen 3 specific things, some of which they've ended up like getting rid of, but I think some of the ideas are actually quite interesting. So one of the things that they do is they mix sort of thinking and non-thinking things with tags. And that's kind of how they end up having a thinking mode where the model has a long COT, and they can mix that with a non-thinking mode. So both the instant response model and the long COT model basically live in the same model. And this was not true in many cases. Like there was often a thinking mode and a non-thinking model, even at OpenAI. They also have, I thought this was quite interesting, which is they have this like way of early exiting thinking where if they append a special string, they'll immediately stop the COT, and the model is forced to give an answer to whatever prompt is given. We see this even in sort of we see this affordance in interfaces like ChatGPT, where you're able to like terminate the thinking early and try to get an immediate answer, for example. But what we see with this, and I've always thought this was a kind of surprising and interesting thing, which is that as you vary the thinking budget, doing like kind of this early termination trick, you end up finding that the performance of the model kind of degrades gracefully. Like even though, at the lower thinking budgets, these models are kind of getting truncated mid-thought, they're able to give surprisingly reasonable responses even at that point. And we see that consistently, even with very small thinking budgets, the thinking mode models are much better on all of these sort of like mathematical or coding tasks compared to the sort of instant response mode, which is much more of like the classic instruction following plus RLHF models. And so you can then, one of the nice things they do for us is look at the contribution of all of the different components to performance. And in many ways, this is not something that should surprise you too much. If you do sort of this reasoning RL and then general RL, you're able to slowly get improvements in all of the different sort of tasks. Things like arena hard or counterfact QA. These are general tasks for which you want more normal RLHF, and we see significant boosts to that performance across the board. There are some degradations that we see in sort of math and coding because we fuse together non-thinking components, but the degradation is not so bad. I think actually, even though these numbers in an absolute sense are small, in later releases, I think in some of the Qwen 3.5s, they've gone back on fusing both thinking and non-thinking into a single model. I think what they used to call this hybrid models, because they found this kind of drop kind of unacceptable. They wanted to squeeze out all of the juice possible on thinking modes, and so they've now, I think, separated these models from each other. Okay, the very last topic and paper that I want to cover is Qwen 3, or sorry, I flipped the two. It's Coder Next, not Next Coder, which is one of the newer models to come out. And I think if you're interested in general agent stuff, of course there's other agents things to think about, like harnesses. But if you're interested in how do you actually build an agent, this is probably a good report to go read. Qwen 3 Coder Next, great sort of agent post-training paper. But in some ways, post-training for an agent is not very different from everything that we've described. It's not like there's a new agent training algorithm. Really, you should internalize this lesson throughout the entire class. Data is the important thing, right? So if you're going to train an agent or post-train for an agent, what are you going to do? You're going to get the data together, right? So there's two parts to the data. To get a lot of the capabilities, you can't just inject them at the end. You have to probably start a little bit earlier. And so there's an extensive mid-training phase that happens to try to get as much coding and sort of agent-like capabilities into the model as possible. So they'll do things like they'll take repositories and concatenate the files in the repository to generate these very long context data and put it into the model, right? We know that the model is eventually going to see these very long COT traces where maybe the agent has opened a bunch of files, very useful sort of pre-training style data. They take pull requests, and then they try to construct synthetic context for it using RAG that is potentially helpful for understanding the pull request. That all goes in mid-training. They will take documents that they detect using an automated method to have text and code, and then they'll use an LLM to transform this to a nice markdown format, throw that all in as well. And then finally, they're going to have a language model talk about coding on web documents that are coding related to generate sort of coding-ish synthetic data. And then they'll take publicly available coding agents, run them on various environments, which I'll describe later, and the traces of those runs all go into mid-training. They'll do some fairly standard stuff as well, like instruction following, and they'll have an additional task, which I think is not super relevant for us, for filling in the middle. Like if you're coding and you want to fill in the middle of a span, it's useful to have that ability, so they throw some of that data into mid-training. But otherwise, this is a very standard but kind of in-depth data collection procedure to try to get some of these agentic abilities into mid-training. And then the Qwen folks do something that I don't know if I've seen before. It's actually quite interesting. They'll take the mid-trained Qwen3 Next model, and they are actually just going to train a whole bunch of different expert models for different kinds of coding adjacent tasks. And they will end up with 4 different agent experts, and then they're just going to distill them all back into the same model. I can only speculate as to why they do this. I don't think I've seen it in other works. The closest one I know of is DeepSeek v3, or was it v3? v3.5, sorry. DeepSeek v3.5, or it's 3.2, maybe 3.2, sorry. 3.2, I think, did this thing where they have different experts whose only job it is to sort of format and process data. So they have data processing experts which generate the data for the full training. But I don't think I've seen this thing of generating different model experts and then distilling them back. That's actually closer to like some academic work like branch train merge and so on. Those are definitely things people do. I haven't seen it much in frontier model training. That said, each of these experts is actually kind of interesting. And what they do is they basically do full-on RL or SFT training on a whole bunch of different subtasks that they've defined. So they have a web dev expert where they SFT on valid web code based on different kinds of checks. They'll do things like build UX experts trained on many different tool formats. And they'll have QA. So the QA agent is just trained on more synthetic data for code. But then maybe the most interesting for us and the most involved is kind of their software engineering agent. And what they do is they construct agent environments at scale. So SweBench is the gold standard of these kinds of things. And so what they want to do is they want SweBench but more. They go out and they have various automated ways based on GitHub to generate a ton of different issues. And given this, they want to basically do RL on these environments. In some ways, very unsurprising. And what do they get? They can get sort of RL performance to go up. One thing I will say here, and this is very kind of important through the broader context of what we're talking about, the reason why we can sort of put more and more compute into RL is because we believe that our reward models are unhackable or difficult to hack. Right? If that assumption breaks down, your RL method will find increasingly obscure ways of cheating you out of your performance. And so they have this great plot of basically, in Git, you can kind of look at future commits or different commits. And if you have an issue and there's future commits, you can just kind of look up what the fix was. Right? And this is a very easy hack for models to learn. And so they basically have a whole reward whose entire purpose it is to prevent the agent from messing with the Git history. And if you don't do this, you end up with a plot that looks like the right, where it's learning, and suddenly you get this kind of emergent jump, where the emergent jump was actually it learned how to manipulate the Git calls to get sort of the history. And in some cases, it can even hack around certain constraints you give it. Like if you tell it you can't use git log, it might add an origin, like a remote, and then query the remote for what happened in certain commits. So there's all sorts of hacking you can do. RLVR is only as robust as your reward, and your rewards can sometimes be not very robust at all. As a sort of side comment, one of my students and I were working on a project that was like RL on Lean. Lean is this formal math, verifiable language. And we naively thought at the time, there's no way this can go wrong. Lots of people have worked on Lean. The Lean compiler is bulletproof. Turns out the Lean compiler is not adversarially robust. There are sort of strings that you can put in it that will allow you to verify proofs that are not meant to be verified in certain modes. So, I think the notion of verifiable rewards is actually much trickier than many of you might initially think. Regardless, you do this process of constructing these GitHub repos at scale. You go through this process of doing RL. You see your scores go up, slow but steady. And in the end, you will actually end up getting a system that is surprisingly good, a model that achieves something like 70.6% on SweBench, even though you have what is basically a really tiny model, a 3 billion active parameter model. You're able to do surprisingly well on these tasks. In some ways, though, I don't know if this is super surprising. Like RL, of course, you're going to be able to do well on the environments for which you've like kind of trained. You might even get generalization to your validation set, as you do here. But you always want to be a little bit careful about comparing performances. Like task-specific performance doesn't necessarily mean it'll generalize to broader domains. Okay. So that's basically all I've got for the RLVR lecture. Remember the core takeaways of this lecture, right? Is it's really all about the reward for RL, right? RLHF and RLVR, arguably they're very similar problems. But, with the difference being really just we want more unhackable rewards so that we can actually put in much more compute and get these systems to be much better. GRPO, at least for the research community, is something that really enabled a lot of this, and you should all know GRPO very well. You should know what the functional form is and how the updates are. This is something that you should know as well as just pre-training losses. And then finally, at this point, I think lots of people know how to do RLVR. As you will find out, unfortunately, RL remains very finicky and noisy, and it's kind of painful to work with. But it's not that hard. It's not like the old days of like you doing PPO on various kinds of like really tricky environments. It's actually a lot smoother than you might think. Okay, I'll stop here for a moment and take any final questions before I let you all go, in case anyone has questions.
One quick question. When you mentioned about the model on is the weight of the model and the backend the same, or do they play prompting, or do they have different underlying models and they compact? Like, how is the situation?
Right. Yeah. So the question was about like thinking mode and what's happening on the back. So the interesting thing about thinking mode really is that it's actually one model, right? And there's just like a little prompt tag that switches them between long and short like long COT and no COT almost mode. Whereas if you just had like an API flag or something, that's not very difficult. The fact that they were putting both of them in together is kind of the interesting bit there.
So you can actually choose no thinking mode, but then you add extra prompt yourself to do COT.
Yeah, or the control mechanism in this case is in the prompt rather than at the API or serving layer or something like that. Yeah, great. Oh yeah.
So you mentioned like the phase of mid-training. I was like wondering like how much of the formatting that goes into the mid-training process like informs what is able to be learned during the RLVR post-training. And then like as a secondary to that question, if you don't have like the correct data in mid-training, then like is it safe to assume that the reinforcement learning can't like sample a correct solution and therefore you can't learn it?
Yeah, so the question was about like the role of mid-training in RL. I think there are a lot of like empirical subtleties here. Like, I don't have like a one-size-fits-all, like it'll definitely not work kind of an answer. But to give a little bit of the nuance, I think pre-training and SFT are doing a lot of the heavy lifting, as long as you have coverage. Like if pre-training just doesn't have any code data, then you're in trouble. You need mid-training, right? But if your pre-training was very diverse and it covered, let's go back to the mid-training slide. If it covered a lot of stuff like text code data, and it covered a bunch of like GitHub, data, then this is very nice to have, but maybe not critical, because you're going to SFT anyway, and the SFT will allow you to get close enough to start getting some rewards for RL. If you didn't have SFT, then then you're in deep trouble. But the fact that we're always going to be doing some amount of SFT pre-RL really helps you. And pre-training has enough coverage, hopefully, that you're able to get some reasonable generalization. So mid-training is very nice to have, very important in order to get slightly better generalization, but not necessarily make or break, I think.
Yeah. Model, you said there's a step after train each expert model, we're going to distill them into a single model again. So how does this kind of distillation work? Do you kind of have to design a data mixed procedure again? Right?
Yeah. So that's right. Like so this distillation procedure is going to require you to write down a sequence of prompts on which the experts will be distilled into the final model. Yeah. I can definitely see the advantages of this approach, which is that you can have a separate team working on each expert. Like it's much easier to like sort of have teams work on this, and then the aggregation could potentially be simple as well if you have enough compute. It's just that if you have all the objectives, you might as well just throw it into the big training loop. Usually, I think that's how you would prefer to do things. That way, you don't have to deal with this distillation complication. You could just have one big training objective that you then do one training loop. Yeah.
Reasoning train also part
Yeah, so the question was, is the long reasoning training part of mid-training? So I think, so there's long COT SFT in both like R1 and KimiK 1.1. Long COT is not traditionally part of like mid-training per se, but it is often, like long COT-like data is used in long context extension. So it's a little bit more subtle. Like I didn't talk about long context extension at all, and I regret that. But usually that's like an additional phase right before RLHF or other things. In this case, also long COT, where you sort of extend the context using any long context data you have. Usually that's a combination of like books, code, synthetic data, because those are the things that are long enough to do extension on. Oh, yeah.
So, like, I guess, like, related to this diagram that's currently up, when you're doing this RLVR process, let's say you have like math, chemistry, many other domains, is it common to do it in parallel, like in one, I guess, like reinforcement learning training, like run, or like do you do it sequentially? And if you do it sequentially, like, how do you avoid like forgetting earlier parts of the learning?
Yeah, I think the closest answer to this question of like, do you do things sequentially or in parallel is, these kinds of diagrams where the two splits that you do is you kind of split amongst like reasoning problems and non-reasoning problems. And the reasoning problems all go in one bucket and they get executed at stage 2. And then sort of the non-reasoning problems kind of happen at the final RLHF phase. And this includes stuff like chattiness and so on and so forth. And those all go into the one later bit, which is the stage 4. Okay, great. Thanks a lot. See you next week.